The world remembers the Second World War as a clash of armies, tanks, and unstoppable industrial machines. But imagine for a moment a different kind of battlefield, one without trenches, without aircraft screaming overhead. A battlefield made of ledgers, interest rates, commodity flows, and currencies trembling under the weight of ambition. Picture this Berlin, 1944. Not the burning ruins we usually see, but a quiet, smoke-filled conference room buried beneath the Reich Chancellery. Maps aren't spread across the table, balance sheets are. The men gathered aren't generals, but economists, financial engineers, and architects of a weapon more powerful than steel. They believed the war would not be decided by who held Stalingrad or Normandy, but by who controlled the global economic bloodstream. Across the table, calculations are whispered like incantations. Oil reserves, gold inflows, debt ratios, black market currency leaks. They weren't planning troop maneuvers. They were planning a takeover of the world's wealth map. Because Hitler, for all his delusions and brutality, understood one thing. Clearly, armies conquer land, but economics decides who keeps it. The Allied command feared this. Not openly, not in speeches, but behind closed doors where Churchill, Roosevelt, and their advisors realized that Germany's most dangerous offensive wasn't on the battlefield. It was in the race to redesign the global financial order. And at one moment in the war, a moment rarely spoken about, Hitler's economic strategists were frighteningly close to winning. The collapse didn't begin with explosions. It began quietly with currencies buckling across Europe as Nazi economic planners drained nations dry through forced monetary unions, trade manipulation, and a shadow network of clearing agreements that rewired who owed what to whom. It was a silent conquest, polite, bloodless, wrapped in accounting language that hid its brutality. Had they succeeded fully, the post-war global system, we know today the dollar's supremacy, the Bretton Woods institutions, the wealth of modern Western Europe might never have existed. In their place would stand a different map. A German-led economic bloc stretching from Paris to the Urals, raw materials flowing in one direction, capital controlled by a central power unlike anything the world had ever seen. The terrifying thing is that the shift wouldn't have required Germany to win militarily. The Allies could have taken Berlin and still lost the real war. Because when an economic order falls, it doesn't announce its collapse with a mushroom cloud. It crumbles like a decaying pillar silently until the entire structure gives way. This story isn't just about history. It's about how the world's wealth map then and now is shaped not by battlefield victories, but by the invisible architecture of economic power. The kind that moves quietly. The kind that only becomes visible when it is too late to stop. And as we peel back the layers of this hidden war, a chilling question emerges. What if Hitler's economists had succeeded? What if their quiet financial offensive had outmaneuvered the Allies? What would the world look like today? And how close did we actually come to that alternate reality? The answer lies in the mechanisms they built, and the mechanisms that still shape our world now. To understand how close the world came to an economic reshaping under Nazi control, you have to understand the mechanism. They built a system not of bullets and battleships, but of pressure points and levers hidden inside the global financial machine. Think of an empire not as a flag or an army, but as a dam. Behind it, the accumulated economic power capital credit commodities presses with massive force. For decades, it holds quietly, predictably, until a crack appears. Small at first, invisible to most, and by the time the water begins to seep through, the collapse is already inevitable. Not because the dam is weak, but because the pressure behind it has grown too large to contain. This is how currency regimes fall. This is how empires lose their grip. And this is how Hitler's economic strategists tried to win a war they knew Germany couldn't win with bullets alone. Their strategy rested on a single unnerving insight. Collapse looks sudden, but it is always slow. A house of cards doesn't fall when the last card is placed, it falls because of the unstable foundation built long before the final touch. Germany weaponized this principle. They created a network of bilateral clearing agreements, contracts, that forced occupied and friendly nations to trade with Germany using artificial exchange rates set entirely by Berlin. To the casual observer, it looked like trade, but underneath it was a siphon. Germany paid in paper credits while taking real commodities, oil, metals, grain, machinery. The imbalance grew quietly like a wildfire, smoldering underground, invisible until flames erupted. Meanwhile, the Reichsbank engineered a monetary trick that even Allied economists underestimated. They flooded occupied territories with currency pegged to the German mark, binding local economies to German decisions. If these currencies collapsed, entire nations collapsed with them. If Germany defaulted, the debt chain snapped in a direction that favored Berlin. This wasn't warfare in the traditional sense. It was economic gravity. The harder Europe tried to escape, the more it became trapped. Confidence, the invisible force that makes money valuable, was Germany's ultimate target. Because confidence is fragile. It doesn't shatter slowly. It shatters like a mirror. One fracture becomes many. A single shock cascades through every reflection. And during the early years of the war, the Allies felt the tremors. Britain's gold reserves evaporated at a terrifying pace. The French franc wavered. Eastern Europe's economies folded like brittle paper under German pressure. For a fleeting moment, Germany came dangerously close to creating a continental economic union, not through diplomacy, not through victory parades, but through a financial architecture strong enough to survive even a military defeat. That is why collapses feel sudden. Because the moment we notice the tremor, the process has already been unfolding quietly for years. Just like a forest that seems lush and healthy until a spark lands on the dry underbrush we never bothered to examine. And the world was about to watch that spark ignite, first in one empire, then another, and finally across an entire continent. These collapses reveal the pattern, one that repeats through centuries, one that Hitler's economists understood frighteningly well. To see how dangerous the Nazi economic strategy really was, we need to examine a collapse that came long before the Third Reich, a collapse that Hitler's advisors studied obsessively. They looked for weaknesses, fault lines, and mechanical failures in past empires, searching for a blueprint they could exploit. One case stood out above the rest: the fall of the Austro-Hungarian krone in the aftermath of World War I. Before the war, the Austro-Hungarian Empire held together dozens of cultures, languages, and markets under a single currency. It was not stability born from unity, but stability born from habit. Everyone believed the system would continue because it always had. But confidence once again was the silent foundation. And like all foundations built on perception rather than strength, it could only hold until the slightest pressure exposed its fragility. The pressure came in 1914. War demanded money more than the empire could raise through taxation or gold reserves. So the printing presses took over. The krone swelled. By 1916, the currency had doubled in supply. By 1918, it had multiplied tenfold. But collapse never looks catastrophic at first. Prices inch upward, wages trail behind, citizens grumble, but life continues. Then the empire fractured. The war ended, borders dissolved, new nations emerged, but they were all still tied to a dead empire's currency. Suddenly the krone, once backed by an empire, was backed by nothing but memory. People rushed to convert paper into goods. Prices spiraled. Overnight, the savings of millions evaporated into dust. Markets didn't collapse because of the printing presses. They collapsed because the belief that held them together dissolved all at once. Hitler's upcoming generation witnessed this firsthand. The economic humiliation, the silent theft of every family's savings, the chaos that followed it, shaped an entire political movement. And decades later, his advisors dissected that collapse like surgeons studying a corpse, searching for cause-of-death markers they could invert, manipulate, or replicate. But there was a second collapse. They studied a more modern one, a faster one, and one that unfolded in plain sight: the brief implosion of France's economy during the Blitz. Before the German invasion in 1940, France boasted one of the world's strongest currencies. The franc was stable, respected, and widely held across Europe. But beneath that stability lay deep structural weaknesses: fragmented political leadership, sluggish industrial output, and dependence on British credit. Germany didn't need to defeat France militarily to break its economy. Even before German tanks reached Paris, the franc began to falter under the psychological pressure of invasion. Confidence cracked. Depositors fled. Gold reserves drained. The Banque de France watched decades of accumulated wealth vanish in weeks as citizens rushed to convert paper into metal. The final blow came quietly. When Germany occupied France, they imposed a fixed exchange rate, 20 francs for 1 mark. It was economic strangulation disguised as math. Overnight, the French economy was forced to subsidize the German war machine. The human impact was immediate. Factories shut down, store shelves emptied, farmers hoarded grain, parents skipped meals so their children could eat. Entire towns were reduced to ration lines and barter markets. These cases revealed a terrifying truth: empires rarely fall because they are conquered. They fall because their financial foundations rot from within, slowly, silently, and visibly, until an external shock finishes the job. Hitler's economists understood this cycle, and they believed they could weaponize it. If the fall of the Austro-Hungarian krone taught Hitler's economists how empires unravel from the inside, and the French franc showed them how confidence collapses under pressure, two more lessons drawn from two different corners of history completed the pattern they intended to exploit. The first came from Britain, not from the collapse of its empire, but from the moment it nearly did. During the First World War, Britain faced an existential financial crisis almost identical to the one Germany hoped to trigger in the 1940s. Before the war, the British pound was the world's anchor, a currency so strong it functioned like gold. But war spending hollowed out the foundation. Debts ballooned, gold reserves evaporated, and by 1917, Britain had mortgaged its future to American credit. London didn't fall because German armies reached its shores. It fell because its financial machine froze. Ships stopped sailing. Banks stopped lending. Industries ran on fumes. The pound teetered, and the entire network of colonies that depended on British stability felt the tremor. The only reason Britain survived was because the United States stepped in with loans. Without that lifeline, the pound would have buckled, taking half the world's economic system down with it. Hitler's strategists studied that moment obsessively, not because they thought they could replicate it, but because they learned a more crucial truth: even the most powerful empires depend on confidence. Shake it hard enough, and even without invasion, even without occupation, an empire can crumble. The second case they analyzed moved much faster. It was violent, sudden, and devastating. And it happened in a nation that prided itself on disciplined Weimar Germany. The hyperinflation of 1923 is one of the most famous economic collapses in history, but most people misunderstand it. It didn't happen because the printing presses went wild. The presses went wild because confidence died. Once the belief in the currency evaporated, no amount of paper could restore its value. But the terrifying part wasn't the numbers. It was the behavior. A loaf of bread doubling in price between sunrise and noon. Workers demanding wages twice a day. Farmers refusing to sell food for any amount of money. Millions of people who had saved responsibly their entire lives waking up penniless through no fault of their own. Hitler's inner circle watched this catastrophe as teenagers. They saw their parents destroyed their neighbors, ruined their country, humiliated. And when these same teenagers grew into economists, bankers, and political operatives, they brought with them an intimate understanding of how societies behave when money dies. By the time Hitler seized power, his economic advisors had a worldview shaped by these collapses. Currencies don't fail because they run out of value. They fail because people run out of faith. Once the spell breaks, no army, no police force, no political decree can stop the chain reaction. Now imagine combining these lessons into a single strategy. A system designed to drain the wealth of neighboring nations quietly unnoticed. A currency network engineered to trap entire economies inside Germany's orbit. A mechanism that exploited confidence as both a shield and a weapon. This was the architecture of the economic empire they tried to build. And as Europe fell piece by piece, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Each collapse triggered the next. Each conquered territory fed the machine. Each currency absorbed into the Reichsmark bloc tightened Germany's grip over a continent. For a brief dangerous moment, the cycle appeared unstoppable. But only if you looked at the visible world, the troop movements, the territory changes the lines on a military map. The real war was unfolding underneath in a hidden structure of debts, payments, shortages, and quietly shifting power. A structure that was about to reveal its entire blueprint. Behind every empire's rise and fall lies a cycle, predictable, methodical, and as old as civilization itself. Hitler's economists believed they could bend that cycle to their will. They believed they could harness its early stages, accelerate the middle, and avoid the end entirely. But cycles cannot be cheated. They can only be ridden or be destroyed by. To understand how Germany's economic machine worked and why it eventually collapsed, you have to see the cycle not as a diagram, not as a list, but as a living organism. A creature that grows, feeds, expands, becomes uncontrollable, and finally collapses under its own weight. It always begins with hunger. An empire senses scarcity of land, of resources, of credit, and begins to extend its reach. Not because it is ambitious, but because it believes it must. Germany in the 1930s was starving for oil metals, farmland, and foreign currency. The machine was already overheating. The hunger was already devouring the nation from the inside. Then comes acceleration. The empire discovers a mechanism, whether economic or military, that multiplies its power. For Germany, it was rearmament financed by creative accounting. The Reich invented a shadow instrument, the Mefo bill, a secret promise masquerading as money. It was brilliant and dangerous. It let the state spend beyond its limits without triggering inflation. But like any secret, it had a timer. And that timer was already ticking. Next comes extraction. The empire expands outward not to rule people, but to seize the resources it cannot generate at home. Each conquest becomes a fuel tank. Austria provided gold. Czechoslovakia provided weapons. Poland provided labor and farmland. France provided industrial machinery. All of Europe became the battery Germany plugged itself into. But extraction always triggers resistance, and resistance forces escalation. The empire now relies on momentum. It must keep expanding to sustain what it has already built. If it stops, the system collapses under its own debts and shortages. Germany entered this stage the moment it invaded the Soviet Union. It wasn't strategy, it was necessity. The machine needed oil. Without the Caucasus, the engine would die. So the empire threw itself into a war it couldn't win, not because it wanted to, but because the cycle demanded it. Then comes the fracture. Confidence begins to wobble. Small shortages become large ones. Allies hesitate. Neutral nations shift their trade. Debt instruments lose credibility. The promises the empire made, promises that once looked unbreakable, begin to look like illusions. German economists saw the fracture the moment their clearing agreements stopped functioning. Nations couldn't deliver goods. Germany couldn't provide credits. The machine began to sputter. Finally comes the implosion. Not loud at first, not dramatic. A fuel shipment delayed. A creditor refusing payment in paper. A failed harvest. A factory that shuts down because the coal it needs never arrives. Then the collapse accelerates. Snowball becomes avalanche. Avalanche becomes landslide. And the empire that once looked unstoppable collapses with staggering speed. Germany didn't collapse because of military defeat. The collapse began long before the Allies crossed the Rhine. By 1943, the financial illusion was cracking. By 1944, it was shattered. By 1945, the economy was already dead. The military defeat was merely the burial. This is the cycle Germany tried to outrun, manipulate, and weaponize. They believed they could force the collapse onto other nations while insulating themselves. But cycles don't obey human ambition. They obey math. They obey confidence. They obey scarcity. And as the Third Reich's financial machine buckled, a new question emerged, one that echoes into the present. What does this cycle look like today? When we map the collapse cycle onto the modern world, something unsettling happens. The past stops feeling distant. It stops feeling like a historical curiosity. Instead, it becomes a mirror, one reflecting patterns we've grown accustomed to. Patterns we no longer question because we assume the system around us is permanent. But permanence is the greatest illusion an empire ever creates. The post-war order, the one the Allies built after defeating Germany, was designed specifically to prevent the economic strategies the Nazis almost perfected. Bretton Woods created a dollar-centered world to replace Germany's clearing blocks. Global institutions were built to prevent resource hoarding, predatory exchange rates, and the weaponization of trade. And for decades it worked. The United States became the global reserve engine. Europe rebuilt. Japan rose. Emerging markets gained their foothold. The global economic bloodstream flowed with predictable rhythm. But systems age, foundations shift, and the cycle begins again. The first stage is always hunger. Not literal hunger, but financial hunger. The need for more growth, more credit, more energy, more leverage. The global system now consumes resources at a rate that no nation, not even the United States, can supply sustainably. Debt rises faster than productivity. Promises multiply faster than the ability to fulfill them. Just as Germany once relied on creative financing to hide its internal shortages, the modern world relies on perpetual borrowing to fill the gaps. Every major economy is now running a deficit. Every major central bank is maintaining an illusion of stability through mechanisms as fragile as the Mefo bills once were. The next stage acceleration arrived quietly in the 1980s and exploded in the 2000s globalization, a system designed to maximize efficiency by tying every nation into one vast supply chain. It worked brilliantly until it didn't, because efficiency creates fragility. A single broken link, one pandemic, one war, one sanctions regime ripples across continents. Germany once built a network of clearing agreements to trap economies in its orbit. Today's world built something similar without realizing it. Nations depend on each other's energy commodities, currency stability, and consumer markets in ways that make autonomy impossible. Extraction is now financialized. Instead of seizing land, modern powers extract value through debt markets, currency flows, and trade leverage. Instead of tanks crossing borders, capital does. Instead of occupation forces, dependency does. But the fracture stage has already begun. You can see it in the shortages, in the supply chain disruptions, in the currency volatility, in the sudden violent swings of energy markets, in the way nations are reshoring factories and stockpiling commodities. These are not ordinary events. They are symptoms of confidence losing altitude. The world thought Germany's collapse was due to war. But the truth is that Germany collapsed financially before it collapsed militarily. Today's world may face the same inversion. The financial fracture comes first. The political fallout arrives later. The question raised by Hitler's economists, one that terrified Allied planners, still haunts the global system. What happens when an economic bloc loses confidence not gradually but suddenly, not from invasion but from arithmetic? Because the modern world is beginning to replay the same cycle. Nations are shifting to new alliances. Alternative currency blocs are emerging. Debt loads are reaching historical extremes. Commodity flows are being weaponized. And the foundational assumption that the current system is permanent is beginning to crack. This is not conspiracy. It is cause and effect. It is the same mathematical gravity that dragged past empires into collapse and that now tugs at the modern world's edges. The cycle is moving. The mechanism is engaged. But what would trigger the cascade? What single moment could turn slow erosion into sudden collapse? Every collapse begins with a trigger. Not always dramatic, not always visible. But the difference between slow decay and sudden implosion is a moment, a spark that turns pressure into rupture. If Hitler's economic advisors taught us anything, it's that systems rarely fall because they grow weak. They fall because a single shock exposes how weak they already were. Today, the world faces three plausible trigger points. Not predictions, not fantasies. Just straightforward cause and effect scenarios that follow the same pattern history repeats when the cycle matures. The first trigger is currency fracture. For decades, the global financial system has depended on one currency functioning as the gravitational center. When trust in that currency falters, when foreign buyers hesitate, when bond markets wobble, when geopolitical rivals build alternatives, the entire structure becomes unstable. It doesn't take a collapse, it takes hesitation, a pause in demand, a moment of doubt. Just as confidence in the franc cracked under the pressure of German invasion, today's anchor currency could experience a crack triggered by rising debt, political dysfunction, or a sudden loss of foreign appetite. Once confidence slips, it doesn't return gracefully. It rushes out like water through a broken seal. The second trigger is commodity shock. Empires run on energy. Germany needed oil from the Caucasus. Japan needed rubber metal and fuel. Modern economies depend on the steady flow of oil gas, rare earths, fertilizers, semiconductors, and shipping lanes. Disrupt even one of these, and the world does not slow, it seizes. A blockade, a war, a sanctions regime, or even a climate-driven production failure could snap the supply chain architecture that globalization built. Suddenly factories shutter, prices spike, shortages cascade. Commodity shocks always reveal which nations built real resilience and which built illusions. The third trigger is debt ignition. Debt doesn't collapse gradually, it collapses mathematically. When interest payments exceed economic output, the system crosses a threshold that cannot be reversed. Germany reached this point in 1943 when its clearing agreement stopped working and its MEFO obligations came due. Today, several major economies are walking the same edge. If one falters, one sovereign default, one banking failure, one credit market freeze, the contagion spreads. Because debt is not national anymore, it's global. And contagion doesn't scale linearly, it scales exponentially. Once a trigger fires, the cascade follows its own logic. Trade routes tighten, banks retreat, nations hoard, markets freeze, supply chains unravel, political leaders respond with emergency measures, price controls, capital restrictions, desperate credit injections, but these only delay the inevitable. Because at this stage, the crisis is no longer financial, it is psychological. Confidence breaks, and when confidence breaks, no institution can repair it. The timeline accelerates. What once took years now takes months. What once took months now takes days. The world watches as once powerful economies behave exactly as Austria did in 1921, as France did in 1940, as Germany did in 1943, desperate, reactive, improvisational. The collapse isn't cinematic, it isn't dramatic, it is suffocating, quiet, and painfully predictable. A slow-motion disaster that turns fast the moment people realize it has already happened. And in that moment, the question that haunted Allied strategists in 1944 becomes the question of the modern age. What will the world look like on the other side of the cascade? And who, if anyone, will control the map that emerges afterward? Because the human cost is the part no economic model, no strategist, no historian likes to confront. But it is the part that matters most. When systems collapse, the numbers on charts are the first to break, but the human world is the last to feel the full weight. And when it arrives without mercy. In every historical financial unraveling, the suffering followed a pattern so consistent it's impossible to ignore. Markets fall first, then institutions, then governments. But the human fallout begins quietly at the edges. It starts with shortages, subtle at first, then relentless. A grocery store shelf missing one item, then two. Then entire aisles looking thinner each week. Farmers begin holding back crops. Truckers hesitate to take unprofitable routes. Warehouses lock their stock behind guarded gates. Money stops behaving like money. The same bill that bought a meal yesterday buys only bread tomorrow. People rush to convert cash into anything tangible: food, fuel, clothing, metal tools. Those with savings watch their life's work melt into irrelevance. Those without savings slide into panic. Those with power pretend nothing is wrong. Parents skip meals so their children can eat. Hospitals run out of basic supplies. Small businesses die quietly. Larger ones collapse loudly. The wealthy flee first, not because they see the future better, but because they can afford the exits. The middle class holds on the longest until they can't. This is how systems die. Not with riots in the streets, but with exhaustion in the home. And even then the question remains, can the collapse be stopped? History offers a bitter answer. Once a cycle reaches the fracture stage, once confidence breaks, the machinery cannot simply be reversed. No leader has ever restored a dying currency through speeches. No empire has ever reversed a commodity shock through optimism. No superpower has ever erased mathematical constraints through force of will. The Allied powers learned this lesson in the 1940s. Hitler's economists learned it the hard way. And the modern world will learn it again if the trigger ever fires. But here's the part. The textbooks soften, the part most analysts avoid. Even a collapse does not spread evenly. Wealth doesn't disappear, it migrates. Power doesn't vanish, it shifts. When one empire falls, another rises. When one currency dies, another steps into its place. When one economic map burns, a new one is drawn from the ashes. If Hitler's economic advisors had succeeded, if their clearing blocks, currency pegs, and extraction networks had survived the war, the modern wealth map would be unrecognizable. Europe would be a single economic organism, its resources flowing inward. The dollar might never have become the global reserve currency. The post-war boom that built the middle class might never have happened. Entire regions that prospered after 1945 would have remained poor. And the institutions that shape global finance, from the IMF to the World Bank to the EU, might not exist. The terrifying truth is that the financial war they fought mattered more than many battles we memorialize. Because wealth maps outlast borders. Economic victories outlive military ones. And when the Allied economists defeated Germany's financial system, when they dismantled the clearing blocks, rewired the currency flows, and replaced the continental architecture with a dollar-led order, they weren't just ending a war. They were redrawing the future. But even that order is not eternal. Every empire believes it is. Every currency believes it will last forever. Every economic system believes it is immune to the cycle, until the moment it isn't. Empires don't die from invasion. They die from mathematics. Slow, until suddenly. If you want more deep dive historical investigations like this, stories that reveal the hidden machinery behind war power and the fate of nations, subscribe for the next documentary. Because sometimes the most important battles are fought in silence.